It had been years since Melanie had thought about high school, and even longer since she'd seen her old friends. When the reunion invitation arrived in the mail, she tossed it aside, assuming she'd skip it. But over the weeks, a small spark of curiosity lingered, and eventually, she found herself mentioning it to her husband, Tom. They'd been married for 10 years, stable and predictable, though she sometimes felt as if they'd settled into a routine as predictable as their jobs. "Think you'll go?" Tom asked, looking up from his work laptop at the kitchen table. "I don't know. Part of me wants to see everyone, but it's been forever. I'd feel so out of place." Tom leaned back, giving her a reassuring smile. "Maybe it's exactly what you need. Go, have fun. I can take care of things here for a weekend." Encouraged by his support, she decided to go, despite feeling nervous. As the date crept closer, she grew excited, picking out a dress, going for a new haircut, even splurging on a makeup session the morning before she left. She hadn't pampered herself in years, and the weekend away from her usual routine made her feel alive. The reunion was held at a swanky hotel, and as soon as she stepped into the ballroom, Melanie's nerves gave way to nostalgia. Familiar faces beamed at her. Voices she hadn't heard in years filled the air, and memories came rushing back. She sipped her drink and mingled, surprised at how much she had missed this carefree part of her past. Then she saw him. Andrew Green had been the classic high school heartthrob, the one every girl secretly liked. He had the smile, the charm, and a knack for making every moment feel like an adventure. Melanie had once nursed a quiet crush on him, but he'd barely noticed her back then. Now, after all these years, he was standing at the bar, looking every bit as charismatic as she remembered, if not more. She felt a flicker of excitement as he caught her eye and waved her over. They exchanged casual small talk, reminiscing about their high school antics and mutual friends. The years melted away as they laughed, sharing stories that felt both fresh and distant. It was easy to talk to him, and for the first time in ages, Melanie felt like a younger, more vibrant version of herself. The evening slipped by, and soon they were standing alone on the hotel balcony, looking out over the city lights. The crisp night air was filled with the scent of jasmine, and Melanie felt herself leaning closer, caught up in the moment. Andrew turned, his gaze intense, and for a split second, she felt the undeniable urge to close the distance between them. But she pulled back, reality sinking in. She was married, and this was just an innocent reunion, right? Yet the evening left her feeling conflicted, with a tension that lingered long after she left the hotel. The next morning, she found herself overanalyzing every moment, wondering if the attraction had been real, if Andrew had felt it too. As she packed to head back home, her mind raced with thoughts she hadn't felt in years, thoughts that nagged at her even as she walked through her front door and into Tom's welcoming arms. But what she didn't know was that this chance encounter would set off a series of events that would unravel her marriage and force her to confront parts of herself she'd long hidden away. Back home, Melanie tried to shake off the strange thrill lingering from her encounter with Andrew, but as the days went by, she found herself thinking of him more than she should, replaying their conversation in her mind, savoring the way he'd looked at her. The routine at home felt especially dull in contrast. Work, chores, quiet evenings in front of the TV. And though Tom was kind and steady as always, a certain restlessness began to creep into Melanie's life. Then, a week later, she received a message. It was from Andrew. The little notification on her phone with his name sent her heart racing before she even read the words. "Hey, Melanie. It was really great seeing you at the reunion. I hope it's not weird for me to reach out. but I couldn't stop thinking about how much fun we had. Hope you don't mind if we stay in touch." She hesitated for a moment. Part of her knew that responding could be a slippery slope, that this could lead somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to go. But there was another part of her, a more reckless, curious side, that couldn't resist. She found herself typing back, almost instinctively. "Of course, I don't mind. It was amazing seeing you too. I'd love to stay in touch." That single exchange opened the door. Over the following days, they began texting more and more, sharing little jokes and snippets of their lives. At first it felt innocent, a harmless reconnection between old friends. But soon, their conversations turned more personal. He asked about her life, her marriage, her dreams. Melanie found herself confiding in him, sharing things she hadn't even told Tom. Andrew seemed genuinely interested, as if he understood her in ways Tom didn't. He made her feel young, alive, as though the version of herself she'd left behind in high school was slowly re-emerging. And soon, she was looking forward to his messages in a way that made her stomach twist with guilt. One evening, while Tom was out running errands, Andrew sent a message that felt like crossing a line. "If you ever want to relive the old days, we could always grab a coffee sometime. Just us." The suggestion hung in her mind, an invitation she knew she should turn down, but the idea of seeing him again, alone, thrilled her in a way she hadn't felt in years. She tried to tell herself it was harmless, just a coffee between friends. Yet, as she typed her reply, her hands trembled. "Sure, I'd like that. Let me know when you're free." They agreed to meet that Friday at a cafe on the other side of town. Melanie told herself it was just coffee, but she found herself trying on different outfits, looking for something that felt casual, yet flattering. Her pulse raced as she slipped on a dress she hadn't worn in years and studied her reflection in the mirror. When she arrived at the cafe, Andrew was already there, waiting at a small table near the window. He looked up, his face breaking into a smile as she walked in, and all her doubts evaporated. He pulled her into a warm hug, his arms lingering around her just a moment longer than necessary. Her heart was pounding as they sat down, a nervous energy buzzing between them. They chatted easily, their laughter filling the space between them. She found herself leaning forward, hanging on to his words, studying his face as he spoke. There was an undeniable spark, an electricity that neither could ignore. She felt her guard slipping, her commitment to her marriage blurring with each passing minute. Finally, after an hour of flirtatious banter, he reached across the table and placed his hand on hers. Melanie's breath caught as he looked into her eyes, his voice soft. "Melanie, I have to be honest with you. I've been thinking about you every day since that night. I don't want to overstep, but I can't ignore how I feel." Her heart was racing, torn between desire and guilt. She knew this was a line she shouldn't cross, but his hand felt warm, grounding her in the moment. Without thinking, she whispered, "I feel it too." In that moment, it was as though a dam had broken. She felt herself drawn to him, the years of routine and predictability in her life slipping away as she leaned in. Their lips met, softly at first, then with a surge of passion that had been building between them since the reunion. For the first time in years, she felt free. They parted, both breathless, looking at each other with a mix of exhilaration and fear. "What are we doing?" she whispered, half to herself. Andrew squeezed her hand, a wicked glint in his eye. "Something we've both been wanting for a long time, I think." They left the cafe together, and Melanie's heart was pounding all the way home. She couldn't believe what had just happened, yet part of her felt more alive than she had in years. But as she walked through the door and saw Tom's car in the driveway, the weight of what she'd done settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She tried to act normal, to push thoughts of Andrew from her mind, but the guilt gnawed at her, mingling with a dangerous excitement she couldn't deny. What she didn't know was that this affair would not only unravel her marriage, but lead to consequences she never saw coming. Melanie tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, but she couldn't stop thinking about Andrew. Every text, every stolen moment they shared, made her feel reckless and electrified, as if she were living two lives. Tom, unsuspecting as ever, didn't seem to notice her sudden absences or the newfound glow in her eyes. He was still the same reliable, loving husband, but now, whenever he looked at her with affection, Melanie felt the sharp sting of guilt. A few weeks into her affair, Andrew suggested they meet at a secluded cabin, an hour out of town, a place where they could be alone without fear of discovery. She knew it was risky, too risky probably, but she was too wrapped up in the excitement to refuse. He made her feel like someone new, someone daring and unburdened by responsibility. And for a few hours each weekend, that was exactly what she became. On the morning of their cabin rendezvous, Melanie lied to Tom, telling him she had an all-day work event. She felt her heart racing as she packed a small bag with everything she needed. Tom, as usual, was supportive, even giving her a quick kiss on the cheek before she left. "Have a great day, Mel. Don't work too hard," he teased, smiling. She forced a smile, swallowing the knot of guilt forming in her throat. "I'll try not to." The drive to the cabin was a blur of anticipation and nervous energy. When she arrived, Andrew was waiting for her, leaning against his car with that easy, confident smile that made her knees weak. He pulled her into his arms, and they shared a long, hungry kiss, as if they'd been waiting for this moment their whole lives. Inside the cabin, they lost themselves in each other, the world outside forgotten. Hours passed in a haze of whispered promises and stolen touches, and Melanie felt as if she were floating, untethered and free from every weight she'd ever carried. She knew she was risking everything, but in that moment, it felt worth it. But as the sun began to set, a nagging worry crept into her mind. She'd been gone much longer than planned, and her phone, which she'd left in her bag, had dozens of missed calls. From Tom. Her heart sank. She'd never ignored so many calls from him, and he'd surely be worried. She quickly got dressed, pulling on her jacket with shaking hands, her pulse pounding as she gathered her things. Andrew noticed her panic and gently took her arm. "Hey, relax. You're okay. Just tell him you got caught up at work," he murmured reassuringly. But Melanie could barely focus, the thrill of the day now tainted with the fear of what awaited her at home. "I have to go. I'll text you later." She drove home in silence, rehearsing her excuse and hoping it sounded convincing. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw Tom's car, his shadow in the living room window, pacing. Her stomach twisted with dread. She stepped inside, forcing a smile. "Hey, sorry I'm so late. The event ran long and I couldn't get away," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But Tom was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, a mix of suspicion and something darker. He looked at her in silence for a long moment, and she could feel his gaze piercing through her, as if he could see straight into her guilty heart. "You were at work?" he finally asked, his voice quiet, almost too calm. "Yes," she replied, trying to sound casual. "It was just a last-minute thing, and Why didn't you answer your phone?" he cut in, his tone sharper. "I called, texted. I even tried calling some of your coworkers. No one seemed to know about any work event." Her blood ran cold. She hadn't thought about anyone calling her coworkers. She'd counted on her absence slipping under the radar, unnoticed. Now, with Tom's questioning eyes locked on her, she felt her lies unraveling. I was busy, Tom, she stammered, grasping for words. It was chaotic. Maybe they just didn't hear about it. But Tom's expression hardened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Melanie, don't lie to me. I know you weren't at work. Her heart pounded, every excuse dissolving under his gaze. She tried to brush past him, but he grabbed her wrist gently, holding her in place. Where were you? He asked, his voice low but filled with a hurt she had never heard before. Melanie's mind raced, her heart hammering as she stared at the man who had stood by her for so many years. She wanted to tell him the truth, to spill every detail and finally rid herself of the guilt she'd been carrying. But the fear of what that truth would do to him and to her life kept her silent. I was with a friend, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom's expression changed, a flash of pain crossing his face, before he let go of her wrist, stepping back as though he were seeing her for the first time. She wanted to reach out, to erase the distance growing between them, but the words wouldn't come. Is that what you call it now? He asked bitterly. Being with a friend? Melanie looked away, unable to meet his eyes. She knew he didn't believe her, but a part of her hoped he'd let it go, that he'd accept her half-truth and they could move past this. But the damage was done, and Tom's silence was filled with a tension that made the air feel thick and suffocating. I'm going to bed, he said quietly, turning away and heading down the hallway without looking back. Melanie stood there, paralyzed by shame, as she watched him disappear into the darkness. She felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that one wrong step could send her life spiraling into chaos. But even as she tried to convince herself to end things with Andrew, a part of her knew she couldn't. She was in too deep. Yet, what she didn't know was that Tom had already begun piecing together the fragments of her deceit, and he wouldn't rest until he had the truth. In the days that followed, Melanie tried to mend the widening rift between her and Tom. She acted extra attentive, cooking his favorite meals, planning cozy movie nights, hoping to restore the harmony she'd broken. But Tom remained distant, his responses clipped, his gaze averted. His silence weighed on her, a heavy reminder of her betrayal. Meanwhile, she continued seeing Andrew. Their meetings grew more secretive, the thrill of sneaking away only fueling her desire to keep going, even though she knew the danger of what she was doing. She told herself it was temporary, a distraction that would eventually fade. She promised herself each time would be the last, yet found herself returning to him again and again. Then one night, everything changed. Tom had left for what he said was a quick work meeting in the city. Melanie thought little of it and settled in for a quiet evening. But around midnight, she received a text from an unknown number. Her heart dropped when she read it. I know about Andrew. The blood drained from her face as she stared at her phone, her mind racing. Who could this be? And how could they possibly know? She felt her hands start to tremble as she read the next message. Meet me at the cafe on 5th Street tomorrow at noon, or I tell Tom everything. She didn't sleep at all that night, replaying every text, every stolen glance, every lie, wondering how someone had seen through it all. She tried to think of who might know, but nothing made sense. Could it be a friend? A coworker? The thought of her secret being exposed was terrifying, but she knew she had no choice but to go. The next day, she arrived at the cafe, her stomach in knots. She scanned the room looking for anyone who might fit the part of a blackmailer, but all she saw were strangers. Then, from the corner of the cafe, she saw a figure raise a hand and gesture for her to come over. It was Tom. He was seated at a small table by the window, his face expressionless, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Melanie's breath hitched, and she felt her whole body go cold. She wanted to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only stand there, staring at him, her mind racing to comprehend the scene in front of her. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice low and steady. "Sit down, Mel." She obeyed, sinking into the chair across from him, her heart hammering in her chest. The silence between them was suffocating, the weight of her lies pressing down on her like a storm waiting to unleash. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, couldn't bear the hurt she knew she'd see in his eyes. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he asked quietly, his tone eerily calm. Melanie felt her throat tighten, the words catching there like stones. I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I trusted you, Mel. I trusted you more than anyone in my life. And this is how you repay me?" The pain in his voice was unbearable, and Melanie felt tears sting her eyes. She reached across the table, her fingers trembling. "Tom, please, I know I hurt you. I know this was wrong, but it wasn't about you. I was just—" "Stop," he interrupted, pulling his hand away. "Don't make this about some need you had. Don't try to rationalize this to me." The anger simmering beneath his calm facade began to surface, his eyes darkening as he looked at her. "I gave you everything, Mel. I built a life with you, and you just threw it away for— what? A fling with some guy from high school?" She couldn't answer, couldn't find any words to defend herself. Everything she could say sounded hollow, and she knew he would see right through it. Tom leaned forward, his voice cold. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air, a knife ready to strike. She knew the answer, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. Her silence spoke volumes, and Tom's expression hardened, as if a final piece of his heart had shattered. "I thought maybe I could forgive you, somehow," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But seeing you now, knowing you still can't even be honest with me, I don't think I can." "Tom, please," she pleaded, her voice choked with tears. "It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake, one I regret more than anything in my life. I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes." He shook his head, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't place. "Maybe it's too late for that, Mel. Maybe you should have thought about that before you made all those mistakes." They sat in silence, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy between them. Melanie reached for his hand one last time, desperate to bridge the gap she'd created. But he pulled away, a final rejection that hit harder than any words could. "I need some time," he said quietly, standing up. "You'll hear from me when I'm ready." And just like that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her alone, drowning in the mess she'd created. She knew he would never look at her the same way again, that she had lost a part of him she could never get back. Melanie spent the rest of the day replaying their conversation, unable to escape the consequences of her choices. For the first time, she saw the enormity of what she had done, the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. But even then, she didn't realize the lengths Tom would go to ensure she felt the same betrayal he did, and more. The following days were a torment. Tom moved out that night, taking only a small suitcase. Melanie spent every moment gripped by anxiety, waiting for him to call, to give some signal that they might repair what had been broken. Her messages to him went unanswered, her calls ignored. Each day felt like a slow unraveling of her life, as if everything she'd taken for granted was slipping through her fingers. But the weeks passed, and slowly, Melanie adjusted to the cold silence. She went through the motions, pretending to friends and coworkers that everything was fine, while privately, she was a wreck. Andrew reached out a few times, but even he seemed to sense that whatever thrill had existed between them was gone. Their last conversation was brief, both of them acknowledging that the time they'd shared had come to an end, as if it were nothing more than a passing phase. One night, when Melanie was finally starting to pick up the pieces, she received a notification that sent her reeling. A court summons. Her hands shook as she scanned the document, her heart sinking as she read the details. Tom was suing her for divorce, and he wasn't just asking for a split of their assets. He was seeking alimony, along with a public release of their marriage settlement. Melanie's mind raced as she processed the implications. This wasn't a private matter. Tom was making sure their split and her infidelity would be a matter of public record. Her betrayal would be known to anyone who cared to look. Desperate, Melanie called Tom. To her surprise, he answered. "Tom," she breathed, her voice laced with panic. "Please, let's talk. You don't have to do this. We don't have to make it messy." His silence on the other end felt endless. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and detached. "Do you really think you deserve an easy way out after everything you've done, Melanie?" She flinched at his tone, but forced herself to respond. "Please, I know I hurt you, but making everything public, do you really want everyone to know?" "Oh, I'm counting on it," he replied, his voice taking on a dark edge. "You wanted to live a double life, didn't you? Well, now you get to own it, all of it. I think it's only fair." Melanie's throat went dry. She realized then just how deeply she had underestimated the depth of his pain and anger. She tried to plead with him, but he cut her off. "Don't contact me again," he said, his voice a mixture of disappointment and finality. "I'll see you in court." The line went dead, leaving Melanie alone with her guilt and dread. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a nightmare. The whispers started slowly at first, friends and family reaching out to her, hesitant and curious. But as the court date neared, the rumors spread like wildfire. She'd lost friends who she'd thought would always be there for her, some even publicly condemning her on social media. Her work relationships grew strained, and even her family looked at her with a mixture of pity and disappointment. When the court hearing arrived, Melanie could barely meet Tom's gaze as they entered the room. He looked stronger, as if the act of dragging her betrayal into the light had somehow restored him. She, on the other hand, felt like a shadow of herself. Her once vibrant confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching regret that she couldn't seem to shake. The judge heard their case, Tom's lawyers presenting evidence of her affair with a ruthless precision. Every detail of her relationship with Andrew was laid bare in court. The texts, the trips, the cabin weekends. Melanie sat there, mortified, feeling as if her very soul was being stripped in front of strangers. The judge ruled in Tom's favor, awarding him a substantial share of their assets, along with monthly alimony. As the final verdict was read, Tom stood, turning to look at her for the first time in months. His expression was unreadable, a cold satisfaction in his eyes. "This is goodbye, Melanie," he said softly. "You're free to be with whoever you want now. Enjoy your freedom." And then he walked away, leaving her standing there, crushed under the weight of her choices. In the months that followed, Melanie tried to rebuild her life, but it felt like trying to start over on scorched earth. Her reputation was tarnished, her finances decimated, and the stigma of her affair followed her wherever she went. She distanced herself from Andrew, who had also faced fallout from their involvement. The thrill that had once consumed her was now nothing more than a bitter memory. She threw herself into work, trying to find solace in routine, but the emptiness was unshakable. She missed Tom in a way that she couldn't put into words. The quiet presence, the laughter, the security that had once been the foundation of her life. Now, she lived alone, in a small apartment, the silence reminding her constantly of all she had lost. One evening, after a long day at work, Melanie sat alone with a glass of wine, reflecting on everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed, and for a fleeting moment, she hoped it was Tom, maybe reaching out to bridge the distance between them. But it was just a news notification, a headline that felt like a cruel twist of fate. Her high school reunion committee had sent an email announcing the date for their next reunion. She stared at the screen, feeling a pang of irony. The last reunion had changed her life in ways she never could have anticipated, leading her down a path of betrayal, heartbreak, and loss. Now, the reminder felt like a full-circle moment, a harsh symbol of everything she had destroyed. With a heavy heart, she deleted the email and put her phone down, staring out into the dark night. For the first time, she understood the cost of her choices, and she knew that some things, once broken, could never be repaired.